On this week's edition of Politicat, we'll discuss the potential of a 21st century arms race, we'll take a look at the rising trend of a collegiate gap year, and reflect on Obama's legacy with the press. This is Politicat, your political news right now. Good evening and welcome to Politicat. I'm Eric Miller, and tonight I'm joined by Sidra Hamidi, and later I'll be joined by Parker Levinson and Abby Blackman. We'll start our news report tonight with recent news regarding the GOP race. Following losses in Indiana, both Ted Cruz and John Kasich have dropped out of the presidential race. This effectively guarantees Trump's nomination at the GOP convention this summer. We'll keep you updated as the race for the White House continues. Now, many Americans may think of the threat of nuclear annihilation died with the Cold War, but that isn't true. A recent New York Times article reports major nuclear powers are once again rebuilding their arsenals, threatening to unsettle the atomic balance of power. Former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry warns that this new buildup will be at least as expensive as the Cold War arms race. The United States alone has pledged to spend $1 trillion on new nuclear weapons. I'm joined now by Sidra Hamidi, who studies 21st century nuclear politics. Sidra, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
So why do you think the United States is choosing to build up its arsenal now?
That's a good question. I think it has a lot to do with the kinds of threats they've been facing, particularly with kind of the resurgence of the threat of Russia. I think that generally there's some question about whether or not the U.S. is still kind of in its top place in terms of its supremacy, in terms of kind of its power in the world, and so it needs to kind of continue to do this. A lot of this can be explained by path dependency too. There was kind of a rationale that started with the Cold War, and that sort of rationale about what it means to be kind of the one power in the world continues on, even though we're way past the post-Cold War era.
So in your opinion, does this new buildup threaten to unsettle the nuclear balance of power?
I don't think so. I think the new buildup will probably just be kind of reinforcing some of the older weapons, trying to make sure that the nuclear triad, in terms of kind of the submarine and land-based missiles, all of those are still kind of up to date. Other nuclear powers in the world have been kind of going through their own process. The UK recently went through a process updating its missile system. So a lot of it is kind of building up or kind of maintaining the like weapons that are already in place, and making sure that those work as well as they can. So I'm not sure it's going to upset the balance. I think the balance was never quite all that upset. It's always been maintained. I think the balance was at a very particular kind of place, like in the early 1950s, and after that, both the U.S. and the Soviet Union kind of went way past what was needed for deterrence. So notions of the balance, I think, they don't quite make sense for the way that the states kind of practice nuclear politics now.
Yeah.
So.
And is this, in your opinion, a necessary update to the nuclear force, or is it kind of just a lot of display and pomp and circumstance?
Well, so I think the question is kind of necessary for what, right? So necessary for deterrence theory to work. It's probably not the case, because for deterrence to work, you only need like a very small threshold of weapons to be functioning. You need second strike capability. And kind of beyond that, some of it might be kind of pomp and circumstance. Some of it is like just the military-industrial complex. Some of it is can just be explained by the way that that military-industrial complex works in terms of domestic politics. So some of it is posturing towards the rest of the world, but I think a lot of it can just be explained with that sort of kind of path dependency. Like this is what we do. We need to maintain those weapons in order to make sure that our place in the world is secure. So I think it's kind of a lot of different explanations, but I think mostly the question you have to ask yourself is kind of like, what is this update necessary for? And that will kind of lead you to different answers.
Okay. And of course, nuclear weapons have been a hot topic in the 2016 presidential race. Donald Trump said that he is keeping the possibility of a nuclear attack on the table. Now, do you think the United States will be tempted to use any of these nuclear weapons? I know some of the ones that are being developed are so small that they're almost the size of conventional artillery.
Yeah, so it depends. I think a lot of it depends on kind of how powerful the executive is in terms of making that ultimate decision. I mean, it is the case that definitely the executive has a lot of power in making that sort of decision. So it's definitely a scary prospect to have someone who is saying that, you know, he would definitely use the nuclear option, be campaigning on that. That being said, you know, once someone gets into office, it's very different, and some of the pressures, some of the international pressures, some of the pressures from the rest of the world, I think kind of end up setting in. So whether or not we should be worried about that as a prospect, I think, you know, I think to be realistic, it's probably not that likely. But at the same time, you know, you always want to make sure that's not a possibility.
Of course. And could we see a potential for a situation like the Cuban Missile Crisis, say, something with China over the Senkaku Islands, perhaps?
Yeah, so if something like that happens, I think it would look very different. I think we've come a long way from kind of the conventional Cold War rivalry, and because of that, you know, I think if some sort of crisis like that were to occur, it would look very different, and I think that there would be a lot more communication. I think there was just a lot more distrust that existed in that relationship than the one that exists between the U.S. and China, or the U.S. and Russia now. So.
Okay.
So
great.
it would look very different if it was a possibility.
Yeah. Well, Sidra, thank you very much for joining us. And of course, nearing the end of his second term, Obama has deeply involved himself with the issue of nuclear weapons. We'll look to see how the next White House chooses to address the topic. And when we come back, we'll look at the increasing trend of gap years for incoming college students.
At Northwestern, we were wildcats in every way.
Northwestern break right through that. With our colors flying, we will cheer you all to go. Go you Northwestern, fight for the sweet victory, for the fame of our fair name, and go Northwestern, win that game. Go Cats!
At Northwestern University, we are pioneering innovation and achieving excellence across every imaginable discipline. At Northwestern University, the possibilities are endless.
Welcome back. The White House announced last Sunday that Malia Obama, the eldest daughter of current President Barack Obama, will attend Harvard University. However, the first daughter has decided to defer enrollment until 2017, electing to take a gap year, a growing trend among high school graduates today. Politicat's Margaret Korn and Kara Stivic have more.
A relatively new phenomenon, the gap year is a year between high school and college that gives pre-college students the opportunity to explore different areas of interest. Students typically have already been accepted into their respective colleges before the gap year begins. These students then enroll as freshmen the following fall and join the next year's freshman class. Gap years originated in 18th century England when men would take time off after secondary school to travel before beginning further academic pursuits. It was popularized by current Princes William and Harry when they did not directly enroll in their respective schools. In England today, many young adults still pursue gap years to either work or travel. In America, however, gap years remain politicized and polarized since their effects within the American education system have not been observed on a mass scale. Further, many gap year programs remain very expensive and raise the question, are gap years a luxury? The rise in gap year popularity comes from the lack of options available to students after graduation. In the 1970s, students could take one of four main pathways post-high school graduation: get a job, specialize in a trade, enlist in the military, or go to college. Given the current job market, students are left to pick from either entering the military or going on to higher education. Less than 1% of Americans join the military, meaning students only have one real post-graduation option: to attend college. Supporters of the gap year cite studies conducted at Middlebury College and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, which showed a 0.1 to 0.4 GPA boost among gap year students. However, universities such as Harvard stress that such GPA boosting effects will only occur if the student engages in meaningful activities during the gap year. Gap year critics point to the higher dropout probability should students not engage in such meaningful activities during the year. According to Harvard's undergraduate admissions website, Harvard College encourages admitted students to defer enrollment for 1 year to travel, pursue a special project or activity, work, or spend time in another meaningful way, provided they do not enroll in a degree-granting program at another college. Deferrals for 2-year obligatory military service are also granted. Each year, between 80 and 110 students defer their matriculation to the college. Due to the industrialization of the gap year, there are more planned and transformative options available for students to pursue. For example, Tufts University has added Global Citizen Year as an option for incoming students. Students that work with this company spend their gap year working in a developing country. Kara Stevick, Politicat.
Whether Malia Obama's gap year will affect students' decision across the country has yet to be determined. The high school senior has expressed an interest in film, and the public awaits to hear her gap year plans. And we're joined now by Parker Levinson, a Weinberg sophomore who also took a gap year. So Parker, why don't you tell us a little bit about your gap year? What did you do?
So I actually spent 7 months traveling around South America. I went to Bolivia, Ecuador, Peru, Brazil, just kind of hanging out and living life a little bit down there. And then when I got back from South America, I worked for 5 months at home to have a little bit of money when I came to college.
And how do you think that helped you prepare for when you got here to Northwestern?
I think it was really good for me, especially. I'd been in school since preschool, since I was 3, and so by the time I graduated high school, I'd been in school for 15 years. I was very burned out. I'd been working really hard to get into Northwestern, and I just needed a break. So having a year off by myself, unscheduled time, gave me the opportunity to experience myself, experience the world, and see what I wanted to do, and also come to Northwestern with a passion to learn. I wasn't burned out anymore. I wanted to do my homework. I wanted to go to class, which I think is something really awesome, especially at a great school like this.
Yeah. So what do you think the value is for other students? Do you think your experiences apply to everybody else?
I mean, I don't want to speak for the general public who takes gap years, but in my experience, students who do take gap years come back to school with a focus. They've seen the world for a year, or they've lived by themselves, and so they know what they want to do. And so they come in knowing what they want to do and very passionate about what they want to do. Additionally, they're just more mature. They're a year older. They've had time by themselves, so they come in knowing how to do their laundry, budget their money a little bit, which I think is really helpful for students everywhere.
Okay, great. Parker, thank you very much for joining us. And when we come back, we'll look at Barack Obama's final correspondence dinner and what it may mean for his legacy with the media.
At Northwestern, we're Wildcats in every way.
Go you Northwestern. Northwestern break right through that. With our colors flying, we will cheer you all to go. Go you Northwestern, fight for victory, sweet victory, spread for the fame of our fair name, and go Northwestern, win that game. Go Cats!
At Northwestern University, we are pioneering innovation and achieving excellence across every imaginable discipline. At Northwestern University, the possibilities are endless.
President Barack Obama attended his final White House Correspondents' Dinner this past Saturday. He roasted the Washington press and ended the night with a literal mic drop, which has us at Politicat thinking about Obama's legacy with the media. And I'm now joined by Northwestern writer Abby Blackman. Abby, thank you very much for joining us today.
Of course.
Now, last March, the Columbia Journalism Review released a report claiming the relationship between the president and the press is more distant than it has been in half a century. Now, do you agree with that statement?
So, you know, the Obama administration has denied more freedom of information requests than any other administration has up to this point. I think that it is true that the administration has a more distant relationship with the media, certainly than the more recent administrations. And I think that that is a product of a couple of things, mainly because of the way that social media plays a role so constantly in our lives, and the way that kind of media has a much more direct relationship with the user. And is like less and less going through media outlets like broadcast networks or major publications.
Right, right. And that study also found that the White House seems to be determined to hide major decision-making processes from the press and, by extension, the public. Now, how do you think that the administration has worked with the media to facilitate coverage of some of the major events of his term, things like the assassination of Osama bin Laden and the Affordable Care Act?
Yeah, so I definitely wouldn't go so far as to say that the administration doesn't work with the media. I think that, like, for example, the announcement about bin Laden's death, I think that the White House worked well with the major broadcast networks to make sure that Americans could turn on their TVs and see that this was the breaking news that they needed to know about and celebrate. And I think that the administration is definitely more hesitant than other administrations to use major news networks to talk about major things going on. So, for example, Obama likes to release press releases through YouTube or whitehouse.gov, things like that. And that's like where a lot of information about things like the Affordable Care Act, like major kind of military initiatives or information about executive action can be found. And I think that that has been going on more and more, like if you look at, by comparison, the Bush administration. But I think that I wouldn't go so far as to say the Obama administration like blatantly does not work at all with current media stakeholders.
Yeah. And looking ahead, what do you think Obama's legacy with the media is going to be?
So I think that Obama has an agenda to push the media to kind of limit the polarization that's taking place, the political polarization in this country. I think that he sees the media, and I do as well, as kind of a major source of that. And so I think that a big part of his agenda is trying to directly communicate with Americans. And so I think that his legacy with the kind of old media stakeholders will be one of frustration, but I think that as media continues to evolve and the definition of media continues to change, he will actually have a positive legacy with these new forms of media like Snapchat, like Instagram, like Facebook, because he kind of is setting this precedent of using those as direct routes to
communicate with the common American.
Okay. Abby, thank you very much for joining us. And with just about 8 months left in office, we'll see how Obama can definitively shape his legacy with the press. Now, Allison Janney, the actress who won an Emmy for her portrayal of Press Secretary C.J. Craig in The West Wing, reprised her role when she appeared in front of the press briefing room in the White House on Friday. Janney took questions as her character from the beloved NBC drama, which followed the president's senior staff and popularized the term POTUS to refer to the president. After a few minutes of banter between her and the press, Janney changed her tone and talked seriously about the opioid addiction crisis currently facing the United States. Janney plays a recovering addict and single mother on the CBS show Mom, and her appearance at the White House was to, quote, celebrate those who are working to help others combat substance abuse disorder. And that's all we have for you tonight. Abby, again, thank you very much for joining us, and be sure to follow us on Twitter. I'm Eric Miller, and this has been Politicat. Good night.